Okay, so this mini lesson is going to be on the housing crisis that occurred during the Great Depression and the New Deal answers to that housing crisis. So first we'll get into the depth of the crisis. How bad was it? It was really bad. We don't know exactly how many people were homeless or evicted or in between homes or whatever you want to say, because it was fluid. What I mean by that is the Great Depression took place over roughly a 12-year period, and things fluctuated. Sometimes people were doing okay, and then other times they weren't doing okay. And some people lost their homes but then quickly found one, or some people were homeless for years. So it's a hard number to quantify, but what we do know is that there were, at any given time, several million people in America with out of doors. And that can be farm foreclosures as depicted in The Grapes of Wrath. It could be mortgage foreclosures or evictions for not paying rent. So what you have here from the big picture perspective, obviously the micro perspective you see depicted in these photographs, terrible anguish, pain, uncertainty, just a terrible crisis. But from the big picture perspective, from where FDR was sitting in the White House, he could see that there were millions of people suffering, but he could also see, that was being shown to him by his advisors, that there were homes sitting vacant, but nobody could afford them, or if they could afford them, they couldn't get a loan for them or whatever. So we had to find a way, we being as a nation, we had to find a way to keep people in their homes if we could, but we also had to find a way to get people back in their homes. And so what we're going to see here are going to be two things. I don't think I made this point very clear on the last video, but I'll make it now. There are, in the New Deal, why it's so impactful and why we still study it today, was not only were there short-term answers to the problems, but there were long-term solutions. So like, for example, with unemployment, on the last mini lesson, I talked to you guys about all the ways in which FDR and his New Deal plan found ways to get people work and get people money in their pockets so that they could live, they could support themselves. But long term, there became a lot of employment protections. There became unemployment insurance, the unemployment benefit that I did refer to, but I don't know if I really went into enough depth in. But basically, that's the long-term thing from the New Deal. We still have that now. There are millions of people that are tapping into that right now, and thankfully they can, because if they couldn't, things in this country would be much, much worse than they are, even though things right now aren't terribly great. And you're going to see that same thing in housing. Short-term answers to the immediate problems, and then long-term solutions to make sure these things don't happen again, or at least they're minimized or reduced, if that makes sense. So, another quick aside before we get into those solutions. What you had with all these millions of people, you had these this phenomenon called the Hooverville. And the Hoovervilles were these shanty camps, these homeless camps, but they were more than just people living under a bridge, although that definitely did happen. These were, they started out really like that, just people living in a tent somewhere in a park, but they were so many people and they were there for so long that they eventually became much more permanent. And you had these shanties, these shacks that people threw together with whatever they could find, or maybe they had a couple of bucks, and so they could buy a little wood or whatever, and some corrugated metal for a roof, and a little stove for their family, and they'd live in these things. But these were on usually abandoned land somewhere, or public land. So this one depicted here is on some like industrial lot somewhere by the tracks. Some of them were in big like Central Park in New York City and things like that. And they were pretty amazing because they actually functioned as little communities. They would have their own government. They would have like some public services, and they would work together and they'd form these little shadow communities living within the larger community. Many times they were persecuted. Obviously, if they're on public land, the public's not going to be too thrilled with their park being taken over. If they're on private land, obviously the landowners aren't going to like that. And they'd get chased off by police and they'd bulldoze the places, but a lot of times they'd come right back. It was pretty amazing. So it was a phenomenon during the Depression, the so-called Hooverville. So the next slide, just real quick. Why Hoovervilles? Well, remember the president at the time when the Depression struck in the late 20s and early 30s, before FDR, was Herbert Hoover. And he took the blame for that. And people's anger was directed toward him. And I mentioned in the last meeting that we had, the last Google meeting, that people want a scapegoat, right? When I was talking about conspiracy theories and this sort of stuff dealing with COVID, the same things apply to all crises, right? Anytime something goes bad, you want someone to blame. People want to blame the person in charge or whoever they see as having power. And when the Depression struck, it was not Herbert Hoover's fault that the Depression struck. You could critique his leadership and say he could have done this better, could have done that better, sure. But Herbert Hoover was not responsible for the Great Depression. However, people were quick to blame him, hence why he got voted out of office pretty severely. But this is true of all presidents, right? They get too much credit when things are going well. They get too much blame when things go bad. That's just the deal about being a president. You're seeing it now with President Trump. He did not cause our current crisis, but his poll numbers are going down. People are holding him accountable for how things are going. Now, you could critique some of the things he did or didn't do or whatever, just like you could Hoover. But in many ways, it's kind of similar. This outside force, this unforeseeable disaster, at least most people thought it's unforeseeable thing happens, and the person in charge gets blamed for how things went. That's what happened to Hoover, why they call them Hoovervilles. So, what did FDR want to do? Well, he wanted the government to step into the housing market. He wanted the government to now play a role, especially the federal government, meaning the national government, play a role in people's housing situations. And so they're going to do a couple of things. The big thing that we're going to focus mostly on is the first one there. The government's going to get into the mortgage business, meaning going to help people buy houses and help people stay in their houses when they're having hard times. The government will also create public housing. For good and bad, this is something that still goes on today. Some public housing is fantastic, right? Some is really well kept up, and they have good systems and good policies, and they do good things for people. Keeping the rent really reasonable to live in a decent home when maybe there's no money to be made in that by an actual landlord. And so the government steps in and kind of fills a hole for quality, low-cost housing. And there's also going to be some tenants' rights, because prior to the Great Depression, tenants basically had no rights. If the landlord said you were out on the street. It was their property. It was their right. Thankfully now we recognize that a home is a really a vital thing, and there should be some legal protections for people to stay in their homes if they're having a hard time, or if the landlord wants to, change the property, sell the property, whatever. Like, you gotta give people some slack, right? Give them time to find a new place to live. Give them a chance to get, caught up on the rent, or whatever the case is. So tenants' rights became a much bigger thing, also part of the New Deal. So focusing on mortgages. So remember, short-term answers to the crisis, but long-term solutions. So this is short-term relief. You see that there in bold. This is for people who are already in a home. They needed a way to make sure they could still make their mortgage payments. They didn't have a job. Maybe they were laid off. Remember, no unemployment yet. That will come as part of the New Deal, but nobody was getting that benefit, especially at first. They weren't paying their mortgage. What happens? The bank will basically kick you out because they bought the house for you, and then they will sell it to somebody else. That's called foreclosure. If there's no one else to buy it, the bank is stuck with all these empty houses. They don't want that. The people don't want that. Nobody wants that. Foreclosure should be a last resort thing. Unfortunately, too many people are at that last resort because things are really bad. So basically what HOLC, or the Homeowners Loan Corporation, was a program where the government would lend you money. And these loans were very, very friendly. Basically, they were only made loans because there are some people in Congress that didn't want to just give money away to people. They thought that was too much, and that the taxpayers should get their money back at least. And so they became loans. And so these loans had really low interest, paid back over long periods of time with flexibility and all the stuff in the terms. So basically, a really friendly, easy loan. Give people money now to pay their mortgage to stay in their house. The long-term solution, and there are a couple of these different programs, I'm not going to get into all the nitty-gritty, but there are things like FHA, which stands for Federal Housing Authority. And basically, what the government did was then say, hey, banks, we know you don't want to loan money out because things are crazy right now. And if you loan money out, you feel like there's a real possibility you won't get it back. And that's businesses, especially banks, are not in the business of losing money. So they want to make sure they get their money back plus interest. Well, the government said, we will back people up, basically underwrite, which means if this person can't pay their mortgage because they mess up or have bad times or whatever, we'll step in and make sure the mortgage gets paid. So no risk for the bank. The federal government's saying, you're going to get your money come hell or high water. Get these people in a house. These things still exist today. They have special programs for first-time home buyers. So think about it now, but in 10 years or so, you might be in a position to buy a house, and you might have an FHA loan because for first-time homeowners, they're a pretty good deal. If you got to qualify for them, you have to have credit and all that stuff. But FHA loans, still a big part of our economy. And there's other things the government does, I'm not going to get into, but basically the government helps people keep mortgages affordable, and people who may not have had an affordable mortgage, meaning the interest rate would have been higher, the government helps them out as well. One of the downsides. All right, the last piece that we'll talk about here on housing was a practice that went on in the New Deal, in the realm of housing, that had a really detrimental effect on communities, especially communities of color, and that was called redlining. Some might argue this is not intentional, but the evidence shows that there's pretty clear-cut things of what went on. So basically what they did is they went around and tried to determine what are the good neighborhoods and what are the not good neighborhoods. Where do we want to support people to live, and where do we not want to dump taxpayers' dollars into money pits, into neighborhoods that aren't any good. And so they created a classification system. It was numbered 1 through 4, first class, second class, third class, fourth class. And they were letter grades like you get in school, A, B, C, D. Federal money would only go to A, B, and C grade neighborhoods. You couldn't get help to stay in your house in a D grade or a red on these maps neighborhood. Many of these neighborhoods were also the neighborhoods where people of color live, black folks, others, who then could get no help from the government. What ended up happening, a lot of black people who did own their homes lost their homes, and they became renters. And the difference between renting and owning a home in the short term doesn't seem like much of a big deal, right? Oh, mortgage payment, rent payment, who cares? It's just money out of my pocket. Well, 10, 15, 20 years down the line, you can sell that house, and in many cases, you can make a lot of money. $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, depending on the neighborhood, right? Property values go up. You can fix up your house and all of a sudden that house you bought for, say, $100,000, you sell a few years later for $150,000, plus whatever you paid down on the mortgage comes back to you. Right? So if you still owed 50 out of that 100,000 you borrowed, now you take out $100,000 in cash from that deal. Now you can buy a bigger house in a better neighborhood, or you can invest that money. That is called wealth. And many black folks lost out on this, and their neighborhoods were greatly hurt by this. And because of that, that legacy, that's when you start to see the first signs of the ghettoization, which is a real thing, of neighborhoods of people of color. And you start to see the sharp divide between white neighborhoods and black neighborhoods in American cities. Now, there was always a bit of a divide, right? But now it's getting very, very stark, right? One where people own their homes, and one where everybody is a tenant, meaning they're all renting. They're not invested in the community. You're not going to take care of a rental house the same way you're going to take care of a house you own, because of that investment thing is not there. So redlining, what you need to know, was a practice that went on, intentional or unintentional. You can argue and debate that, but the end result was still the same. That was really harmful to black neighborhoods in cities across the country, and it led to a lot more inequality. And that's an unfortunate, one of the unfortunate downsides of the New Deal, was this policy of redlining. So that was housing. Some of the things that you should take away from this: the New Deal did a lot of good to help people stay in their homes during the Depression, and then also some long-term solutions to make sure people stayed in their homes and had affordable mortgages going forward. Part of that we need to discuss also is this negative, which is redlining, and there was unfortunately a racial element to that. All right, thank you. And now make sure, if you haven't yet, you start to do some work on the housing articles for that Google Doc I shared with the last lesson.